Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Tonight, in our continuing series of curtain raiser programs on this year's much-awaited budget, we discuss issues to do with taxation. Has the time come for the finance minister to dramatically lower corporate tax? Do proposals for a flat rate of income tax just at 12% make sense, or could they be outrageous? And finally, should some form of universal basic income replace India's multiple subsidies and poverty eradication schemes? Those are the issues we shall tackle today. My guests are the chairman of Oxis Investments, Surjit Bhalla, the managing director of Kotak Mahindra Mutual Fund, Nilesh Shah, the managing partner of BMR Legal, Mukesh Bhutani, and the chief India economist at JP Morgan, Sajid Chinoy. Sajid Chinoy, let's start with corporate taxes. In 2015, the finance minister promised to reduce corporate taxes from 30 to 25%, and he said he'd do this by 2019. So far, he's only taken very small steps. Do you think he should take a big step this year, particularly in the wake of demonetization?
I think he should, and I think he will. And I think the important issue is that whatever move is taken is that this becomes revenue neutral for the government, given other priorities. So I think what we can expect reasonably this year is that the tax rate will gradually be brought down, not in one shot, but that commensurate exemptions are then closed so that we have, from the government's perspective, revenues are neutral, and from the taxpayer's perspective, the tax code becomes much simpler and compliance is much easier. I think that has to be the overarching motif of taxation this year, is you want to simplify the tax code and do it in a manner that is still revenue neutral for the government, given the other fiscal issues that will dominate his budget constraint.
Now, Surjit Bhalla, the Confederation of Indian Industry has proposed a dramatic cut in corporate taxes. They want it reduced to just 18%, including surcharge, and at the same time, they want all incentives and concessions completely withdrawn. How do you respond to that proposal?
Well, first let's look at the FM statement that he would like the tax rates to come down to 25%. If he were to bring the tax rate down to 25%, and leave the surcharge as well as and eliminate exemptions, which is what we are discussing, and leaves the surcharge and the cess in there, this will actually raise the tax rate for the Indian economy or for the Indian corporate. So in other words, right now, today, our effective corporate tax rate, what corporates actually pay, is close to 25%, which is amongst the highest in the world. So if you now take out the exemptions as well as bring the tax rate down to 25%, you're doing nothing. You're doing nothing to help the Indian industry.
So what should he do?
On the other hand, if you were to take out exemptions, which is about 5%, so I propose, what I'm proposing is that he should cut the maximum corporate tax rate to 20% and remove all exemptions, or cut it to 25%, keep the exemptions, and remove the surcharge as well as the cess. So in other words, we need to bring down our effective corporate tax rate by about at least 5 percentage points. The effective one, what they actually pay. If you take out the exemptions basically are about 5% of the tax rate.
All right, that's
so
a very
take out exemptions as well as bring the corporate tax rate down to 25, you're doing nothing.
All right, you're very clear. You want, in effect, the corporate tax rate with the exemptions.
One more point.
With the exemptions also removed, down to something like 20%. In other words, you're very close to what CII has proposed, which is 18%. Now, the key concern, Mr. Bhutani, is that if the finance minister does take his courage in his hands and
one
drops...
other point.
I'm Surjit, I'm going to someone else now, so wait a moment. The key question is that if the finance minister does take his courage in his hands and drops the tax rate, corporate tax rate, to just 18% as CII has proposed, will compliance improve and therefore will revenues rise, or could he find that revenues start slumping at a critical time?
Well, if your question is if he does it, what will happen? But before I get to that, whether it's practical for him to actually bring it down to 20%. Yes, from a medium to long term point of view, low tax rate will certainly see an improvement in the compliance level. There's no doubt about it. The question is whether he will do it in this year's budget. And I always keep on saying that though he promised the phase out to 25% tax rate in the 2015 budget, he missed an opportunity in the 2016 budget. And I think given the compulsions and all the challenges that he's dealing with this year, it's going to be very difficult for him.
You're saying a very interesting thing. You're saying given the challenges of this year, it's unlikely he will take a big step to actually fulfill his promise of dropping the tax rate to 25.
Yeah, and a case in point is just look at the figures that were released on the third week of December. 4.4% net corporate tax collection increase that he's had, as against a budget of 12%. And we still need to see the effect of demonetization because you will feel it on the 15th March installment.
Okay. But suppose, and this is a counterfactual, suppose he takes his courage in his hands and decides that I am going to do something dramatic. CII, as you know, has proposed the corporate tax rate fall to 18%. If he did it, would revenue rise because of better compliance, or would he actually suffer a slump in revenue?
Which year?
This year.
Well, certainly yes. If he
Certainly, yes, what?
If he drops the tax rate to 20%, there would be a drop in revenue in 17-18, no doubt about it. But if you're trying to put out a 3 or 5 year phased out reduction or a 3 or 5 year compliance, then I think certainly it'll sure rise.
We have a very interesting position on corporate tax rates, Nilesh Shah. There is a firm proposal and a firm conviction by both CII, echoed just now by Surjit Bhalla, that dropping to 18 or 20 is the right thing for the finance minister to do. But you've heard a note of caution from Mukesh Bhutani that at least in 17-18, you will see a slump, maybe a significant slump in revenue. Thereafter, over the next 3 years, you will see compliance ensuring revenues rise and perhaps rise measurably. But given that he has a problem this year because of demonetization, what would you expect him realistically to do on corporate tax?
I will actually expect finance minister to improve the compliance, and let me take it in a general context just to illustrate how corporate tax compliance can improve. So we have a unique situation in India where we allow something called bonus stripping, which is a very commonly used word in capital market. Corporates and individuals buy cum bonus shares and sell ex bonus to show short-term capital loss, and that capital loss is adjusted against capital gains to create tax-free income. Now this is something which is a legally allowed tax planning tool. If you stop that, you will probably end up saving 10 to 15,000 crore of tax every year. There is another interesting thing. If a small businessman sells his partnership firm or a proprietary firm, he pays full taxation on the gains. But if an entrepreneur, no matter how rich he might be, if he sells his companies which is listed, then on the listed shares he gets capital gains exemption. Now the intention of government should be to benefit the retail investors, not the rich industrialists.
So what, can I just stop you? So what are you expecting him to do as a result of this?
You can achieve lower taxation rate.
So what are you expecting him to do, Mr. Shah?
Improve tax compliance. There are four.
But are you expecting him on the tax rate? But on the tax rate, are you expecting him to drop it or not, or just to improve compliance at present rates?
If you improve compliance, you can drop tax rates. If you don't improve compliance, you can't drop tax rates because of fiscal constraints.
And very quickly, what are the detailed measures you think he should take to improve compliance? But quickly, please.
In the demonetization drive, a lot of money has been deposited. Use data analytics to find out which of that is passing through the tax net, which of that is not passing through the tax net. Second, use market intelligence to curb practices like bonus stripping, curb the exemption on long-term capital gains available to entrepreneurs. Stop this practice of converting interest income through listed debentures into capital gains. There are 10,001 ways in which tax loopholes can be plugged to improve compliance.
And if all of that happens, what would you like him to drop the tax rate to?
I think somewhere around 20% will be an effective taxation rate. So if you want to give exemptions, make it 25. If you don't want to give any exemptions, make it 20. That will improve compliance, and maybe in the short term it will result into a drop in taxation revenue, but over a period of time you will see the benefit.
Sajid Chinoy, we have a very interesting range of opinions here. Both Nilesh Shah and Surjit Bhalla do believe that there is a case for dropping the tax rate, the corporate tax rate, to around 20. It depends upon, of course, what you do with the exemptions, and it also depends upon the measures you take to ensure compliance. But you've heard Mr. Bhutani say that he is skeptical that would happen, particularly because of the contingencies that surround the budget this year after demonetization. Now, the commentary in the papers suggests that we're not going to get more than perhaps a 1% cut in corporate tax, bringing it down to 28%. And even last year when it came down, it only came down for companies with a turnover of under 5 crore, which is a very small number. If that's all that happens this year, will you be very disappointed?
Not at all. I completely agree with Mukesh. I think we need to be careful here not to trade off medium-term efficiency gains by creating more fiscal vulnerabilities in a year where there are already lots of uncertainties. You know, the history around the world is very clear. Compliance improvements from tax reductions take several years. So if you dramatically cut rates this year, it'll be 3 or 4 years before revenues become more buoyant, number one. Number two, there's a huge compliance improvement scheme in the works. It's called the GST, in the sense that that's going to be the self-policing nature of the GST will bring many more people into the indirect tax net, and then you use that data to cross-check whether they're also paying direct taxes.
Okay.
So, and lastly, I just say there are lots of fiscal uncertainties this year. If you strip away the excise duties from gasoline and petrol, revenues this year have been relatively soft. Next year, we don't know how much liability the center will owe to the states. We don't know if at all any tax resources will be garnered from all these deposits. I think this is not the year, given all the vulnerabilities around the fiscal and the fact that state finances have worsened so materially, something that no one talks about, that I don't think the center can take such bold gambits in this particular year. So I think a reduction of 28%, along with closing necessary exemptions to make sure that in the near term revenue neutral would be exactly what you'd hope to get in this.
So let me just sum up for the audience. We've reached a position on corporate tax, and remember we're only talking about corporate tax at this point, that whilst the CII and Surjit Bhalla are calling for corporate tax to fall as low as 18 or 20%, realistically, given the conditions the economy faces, given the restraints after demonetization, people do believe that it's unlikely the finance minister will take that gamble, particularly because in the first year at least his revenue will dip, and it could dip sizably if he's very dramatic in the corporate rate tax cut. And so the belief is that he will be cautious. Maybe we will see a 1, maybe a 2% cut at best. Let's come now, Mukesh Bhutani, to personal income tax. After demonetization, is there a case for lowering the rates? Perhaps trying to do what President Reagan did, just create 2 dramatic rates? Or do you think, once again, that's unlikely this year? The most we can hope for is tinkering with the slabs.
Well, first look at the positive aspects of demonetization, because unlike corporate tax, it has had a positive effect. And it's going to have even more positive impact in the next 2 to 3 years. You're adding more taxpayers to the tax base, because you're not just viewing demonetization on a standalone basis, but you're also looking at the income disclosure scheme. Second, you're going to have more tax compliant taxpayers in the future. And if you again look back at the figures that were released in the 3rd week of December, you see a certain spike in the in the personal tax collection. I think that trend is going to continue. And in this year's budget, he's also going to add the amounts that would get collected under the Pradhan Mantri Gram.
So then what does all of this permit him to do in terms of personal income tax?
Well, as a country, we have far less number of individual taxpayers than we ought to be having it. My guess is that 2/3 of the population do not pay taxes. I know that's a controversial statement.
But in a sense, Mr. Bhutani, all of that is not. Come to what he can therefore do or can't do about lowering rates on personal income tax.
He's going to play around with the threshold limit, which means that he'll bring the threshold.
So that's slabs he'll play around
That's a
with.
slab.
But what about rates?
I think he will probably start the maximum marginal rate of 30% at 20 lakhs and
So in
above.
other words, he'll play with slabs, he won't reduce rates.
He won't reduce rate.
Sujit Bhalla, in an article that you wrote for the Indian Express with Arvind Virmani on the 14th, you suggested a flat income tax rate of 12% on the grounds that that was the rate the average taxpayer actually paid in 2013-14. And secondly, because you believe that compliance will actually increase by 8 percentage points to 33%, thus giving the government an increased revenue of almost 3 lakh crore. Now, a flat income tax rate of 12% is really very radical. Do you honestly believe that any government is of a mind to take such radical options at this point of time?
Okay. 2 points here. First, the compliance, as everybody's saying, whether you look at corporate tax rates or whether you look at personal income tax rates, is very low in India. Now, I don't care what uncertainties you say, there is just no way in the world you can increase compliance without reducing tax rates. So therefore, I'm afraid I disagree with a couple of the panelists who's saying, wait until all the dust has settled, there are so many uncertainties, and then we got to make it revenue neutral. How the hell are you going to make it revenue neutral if you do not decrease your tax rates? So that's number one. Number two, the more legitimate point about whether 12% is feasible, I don't think it is, because the reaction Arvind Virmani and I got after that article was, in a country like India, it's not feasible. Hence we proposed what I think is a very realistic proposal of reducing the tax rates to 10% and 20%, and thereby allowing for a very reasonable increase in compliance. If all of us agree that compliance is needed, or compliance increase is needed, I would like to ask all the panelists over here, especially those who are suggesting caution, as to how in the world can they get compliance to increase without a significant reduction in tax rates. It's never happened anywhere in the world.
And so you're suggesting that what the finance minister should do, since it's impossible to believe he'll be radical and do your preferred option, which is a flat income tax rate of 12%, in that place you're suggesting what is a second best option for you, two rates of 10% and 20%. But even that is very radical for India. Remember, at the moment we're at 10, 20 and 30. You're abolishing 30 and you're just leaving us with two rates. Do you believe he'll bite that bullet? Give me a quick answer to that, Sujit Bhalla.
And demonetization, all of us sitting around here thought was impossible, was a radical move. If the government can take that radical move, why should it be like all the previous governments in the past and be very mouse-like and not take any steps whatsoever? I just don't believe. The two are not consistent. You cannot take a radical move like demonetization and then pretend that nothing in India has changed.
Well, the truth of the matter is, and I'm not going to argue with that, but governments choose to take the radical moves they want and they choose not to take the ones they don't want, and they can sometimes be very arbitrary and sometimes even a little illogical in what they choose to do and what they don't choose to do. But we'll find out in a moment's time. Let me instead put this to you, Nilesh sir. What would be the impact if Mr. Jaitley were to do what Surjit Bhalla is suggesting, and which is very close to what Ronald Reagan did in the 80s in America, which is to sharply cut personal income taxes and literally leave it with just two rates? Surjit Bhalla is suggesting 10 and 20%. If he were to do that, what do you think would be the impact on revenue and thereafter the impact on the economy?
My feeling is that we can learn from Indonesian experience. They came out with amnesty scheme for their citizens at a very, very low rate of 4%. Indonesia is roughly $800 billion GDP, and last I read, they ended up collecting about $400 billion of offshore assets, ending up Indonesia with $16 billion in kitty, which is 2% of their GDP. But the gain is that this offshore assets declared, which is almost 50% of GDP, will now come under tax net on a legitimate basis. So yes, they probably took a hit in terms of what they could have collected if they had tracked those offshore assets. But we all know how difficult it is, how theoretical it is. So if we go by Reagan experience, if we go by very recent current Indonesian experience, lower taxation rates will act in improvement of compliance, as Surjit is saying, and that might mean a bumper tax revenue for India. It might mean far more tax collection for Indian government.
Okay, Sajid Chinoy, if you heard what Nilesh Shah said, and I'm interpreting him, he's accepting that there is a political risk and perhaps even a small element of revenue slumping in the first year risk if you cut tax rates, but compliance will go up and it should steadily go up thereafter. The problem is that if you cut taxes, I'm talking now of personal income taxes, to just two rates of 10 and 20, it'll look in a country like India that the rich are getting the real benefit because their tax rate falls from 30 to 20. Is that feasible and possible? Can any government in a country like India, where we're so conscious of poverty and so conscious of not favoring the rich, take this sort of step that can be dressed up to look as if it favors the rich more than the poor? In other words, would presentation be the problem that would deter the finance minister?
Yeah, and it's not just a presentational problem. The fact is, in India, too much of tax revenue is indirect tax revenue, which is not progressive. What you want is a healthy balance between progressive direct taxes. Now, I agree with Surjit that lower tax rates do typically improve compliance, with a couple of caveats here, that if you lower them to 10 and 20%, you are giving up on a lot of progressivity, number one. And number two, the earlier point that was made, that yes, this will help compliance over time, but given the fiscal constraints this year and next, is this a gamble you want to take this year? Let me just make one final point. The problem with India, if you do this analysis correctly, is not that tax to GDP is too low. For our level of income, as the economic survey showed last year, we're in the ballpark. The problem is we have too few individual taxpayers. Only 4% of Indian voters pay taxes versus 23 or 24% being the median. Now, one simple, it may not be a popular way to bring more individual taxpayers into the net, is simply not raise those exemption thresholds every year. That's what many countries have done. If you just keep the exemption threshold where they are, as nominal incomes rise, you will bring more and more people into the net and grow your tax base. The economic survey estimates, if we had frozen these threshold levels to what they were 4 or 5 years ago, we could have increased revenues by 0.3 or 0.4% of GDP. So there are other ways to broaden the tax net and improve compliance without necessarily giving up on progressivity.
All right, and therefore, if I can interpret what you're saying, you're suggesting keep the thresholds as they are, don't keep raising them, but possibly reduce the rate so that compliance goes up because the onus and the onerousness of tax is reduced. In other words, you expand the base but cut the rate. Is that what you would roughly approve of, Sajid Chinoy? A quick answer?
That's right. To keep the threshold where they are, bring more people in the net, and that will allow you to cut rates over time, but not give up on the principle of progressivity, given that indirect taxes are the bulk of tax revenues and they are not progressive.
Okay. Sujit Bhalla, I want to come to you because in your Indian Express article, you did suggest a way of getting around the problem, and it's a very real problem in a country like India, that a flat rate of income tax or a sharp lowering of the top rate of income tax looks as if you're benefiting the rich more than you are benefiting the poor. And to get around that problem, you proposed in that article with Arvind Virmani a amended form of what's called the universal basic income, not for the entire country, but for those people earning below 2.5 lakhs a year. And you estimated that's roughly 205 million people. You said each such person should receive roughly 30,000 a month, and you estimated that this would cost 2.9 lakh crore. And you added that this could be fully funded by the increase in revenue from a flat rate of income tax of 12%. My question is, why do you believe a universal basic income is better than the present system of subsidies, PDS and NREGA?
Well, that's very simple to answer. The present system of PDS, which is about 1% of GDP, 125,000 crores, half of it does not accrue to you, me, Ambani, Sajid, or the poor. It disappears. You talk about tax evasion, that's where the black money is. So the point is, we've got a very, very corrupt system of welfare delivery. The PDS, just let me repeat it, 50% of expenditures do not accrue to anybody. They go to liquor companies, they are siphoned off,
so in other words,
they go to flour mills, wherever it is,
the leakages will be plugged.
So,
is there any other reason why this is better than the present system of subsidies, beyond the leakages being plugged?
You save so much and the poor get more. After all, Karan, your purpose is to give more incomes to the poor.
And this
Why
will go
would you
directly.
want to do it by going through a very circuitous route of Narega and PDS or whatever?
Okay.
One other point that I want to emphasize on compliance, and this is what Sajid was saying, that listen, the PM himself announced on 31st, and this is from the government data, that only 2.4 million people in India declare incomes above 10 lakhs. We are very pleased with the lack of progressivity in our tax system.
Sujit, let's not go on to compliance now. We've moved away from compliance. We're now talking about your uniform business income scheme. Let's stick to that, the uniform basic income scheme. We'll come to compliance later on. That's a discussion we've had. I want to explore with you some of the advantages of UBI as well as some of the possible potential problems. One concern is UBI can only work if you have a efficient, well-built, comprehensive infrastructure of Aadhaar and bank accounts.
Correct.
And it has to cover some 205 million people by Surjit's count. Other people have put the count at even higher.
Sure.
Do we have that infrastructure?
Well, I think if you go back into the history, the infrastructure is far better. So if you turn back, the leakages that we saw of the welfare schemes were far greater than what they are today. I think what needs to be assessed is all that has been done in the last few years, whether it's the Aadhaar scheme or whether it's the cashless in the digital economy, is that going to reduce the leakages? I'm not against what Surjit is suggesting, but I still go back to the point that I'm also in for the moderate tax rates. The question is how moderate it should be.
But I take your point. We're not actually saying what Sudhir is saying is going to happen. I'm asking a different question. Do we have the infrastructure to implement it, or is his suggestion in advance of our capacity to fulfill it?
I think it would be too speculative, Karan, to say that we don't have the infrastructure.
We do.
That we don't have. I think the infrastructure is improving a lot. I think as we go more towards cashless economy and digital payments format, it is just going to improve.
So the finance minister could try and do it this year?
You mean the
UBI of some sort?
I think it's unlikely.
No, unlikely, yes, but have you got the infrastructure, or is the infrastructure the problem? Not the political will.
Infrastructure is a challenge, but it is improving.
The other point about UBI, Nilesh Shah, is that if implemented efficiently and there are no leakages, because that's the main reason why Surjit wants to implement it, it would ensure that the amount actually received as opposed to the amount theoretically intended goes up for each person. At the moment, because of leakages, what's intended doesn't actually necessarily get to them. But here, if you plug the leakages, they'll actually get what they're intended to get. How much of a huge advantage would that be?
If we assume average rate of taxation at about 20% in economy, and if the subsidies or benefits which I am giving directly to the recipient, if I can rotate it in economy by 5 times, then the government through this 20% taxation rate will be able to achieve by way of revenue increase the entire benefit of the spending. So by transferring money to the recipient, we will be increasing effect. Now whether it's 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, who knows what the number might be, but certainly it will be higher when the money goes into leakages whereby it probably stays in Tijori before being actually spent. So through direct benefit transfer to recipients, one, you ensure that the subsidy actually reaches the target, but from an economic point of view, you are increasing the multiplier effect. The poor are probably going to spend it faster than the corrupt, and that multiplier effect can ensure far better transmission of this thing in the economy.
In other words, you have a real economic gain in terms of the multiplier effect that goes beyond the fact that you've plugged leakages and the poor get what's intended for them rather than some diminished quantity of that. That's a real benefit because that will add to demand, it will add to production, it will be an incentive for investment. There is one moral concern, Sajid Chinoy, that some people have with UBI, or for that matter with any form of direct transfer, and it's that you're letting people choose how to spend the money they get. There's no guarantee that they'll spend it wisely or that they'll spend it on what you intended them to use it for, because once it's in their bank account, they can spend it for whatever they want. And for example, people in India often say alcohol consumption could increase instead of people opting for better food. Is that a concern, or is that only the sort of issue that people in a nanny state like India bring up because we think we know better than people how they should spend their money?
Karan, couple of thoughts. Firstly, I completely agree with Surjit. Before we get into the details, that moving to cash transfers over time will be the most effective way to plug leakages. Let's not call it universal basic income. That connotes everyone gets it. This is a targeted basic income. Now, you're right. For me, the big advantage, in fact, is that you allow people to spend it as they deem fit. As an economist, that definitely improves utility and preferences because different people have different needs and they have cash rather than goods. There have been cases where this has been spent on sin goods, for example, in the Brazilian cash transfer program, Bolsa Familia, but there have been mitigating factors, and the mitigating factors we typically find, the oldest woman in the household, and you transfer the woman to her, so the money to that person. So yes, let the exception not govern the rule. I think the benefits you get from the reduction in leakages, number one, and the fact that people can spend this on different things. For example, when in Bolsa Familia, what people found is much of the money was spent not on food, but actually on getting children bicycles and shoes so they could attend schools. And then the next step is to move to conditional cash transfers, where you give an additional cash transfer if you do a social good, get a vaccination,
okay.
Attend school. So there are things you can build on. But two important prerequisites here. One is, you're exactly right. The infrastructure is a work in progress. It's going to take some time for all these 265 million people, by definition, at the bottom of the ladder, to have a functional bank account, to get Aadhaar, to become financially literate, number one. Number two, this is a fiscal issue. Let's not, we spoke about why we can't cut tax rates a little bit this year. Just to give people 1,200 rupees a month, which is to meet the poverty line for the bottom 20% of the population, can cost you 3% of GDP or close to that. So we can't have other unfunded liabilities.
Absolutely.
What we need to do is transition away from the existing PDS to NREGA. And maybe one thing to do this year is start some pilot programs where you give people a choice. Either they can avail of all the product subsidies, or they can get this one-time cash transfer, and then people self-select into what works for them.
And that pilot program will give the government an idea of how the whole system would work if it would be done on a bigger scale. Let me put to you one of the problems being hinted at the end of part one by Sajid Chinoy that could be associated with this idea you have of some form of uniform basic income. And that's this. Suppose the government chooses to have a targeted version of it, as you've recommended, but continue with subsidies at the same time. Because politicians like giving money because they believe it wins votes. So maybe they'll try and do both together. How do you persuade them it's one or the other, not both?
It was as far back at 1985 that a politician called Rajiv Gandhi said that there were massive leakages in our food distribution system. So to think that the poor do not see the leakages, the popularity of demonetization is precisely because the poor do see the leakages. The money that was meant for them is going somewhere else. Therefore, I do not think there's any problem, and indeed experiments have been done by, if you will, those people considerably to the left of the political center, and they are now advocating that we should move to cash transfers or benefit transfers. In addition, one last point, and just to show that I'm also in complete agreement with Sajid, the targeted, conditional vaccination, schooling, etc., has been hugely successful everywhere. There's no reason why we can't have that kind of a targeted transfer.
But Surjit very deftly sidestepped the question I asked him, and that is there a danger that the government may accept to implement some form of targeted basic income, not universal but targeted, but continue at the same time with the other subsidies? In other words, try and do it both ways. Is that a danger? Because that would kick up the fiscal deficit hugely.
I mean, there is a clear danger of that, and how will the politicians practice the vote politics if they don't do that? So I think I clearly see.
Is that a danger in Surjit's proposal, that rather than opt for one or the other, they'll try and do both together, and that could beggar the country?
No. So there are two aspects. One is the political part of it. The second is, how will subsidies such as petroleum or fertilizers work? Because, of course, there has been a drive by the government in the last few years to make sure that the petroleum subsidy really benefits the people who ought to benefit from the scheme. But I don't know how practical it is for it to work. I'm not dismissing the idea that Surjit is advocating, but the point is that how will it work in a real sense?
In other words, you can't within a targeted scheme further target it.
That's right. And I think when the transition is happening, if the transition happens to the new scheme, you would encounter a situation where both of them will continue for a while, and what impact will that have on the fiscal deficit?
Let me put another concern to you, Nilesh Saab. India, despite its very credible rate of growth, remains a poor country. We may not like to describe our country as that, but there's no doubt about it. We are a poor country. Now, as far as I know, but I could be wrong, no other poor country has attempted to tackle poverty through a UBI or a fairly comprehensive but targeted basic income. Are we, by thinking along these lines, in danger of overreaching ourselves? Or is this in fact the best way of tackling poverty in a poor country, because you then hopefully plug leakages? Which of the two?
If we see India and China in 1980, we were richer than China, bigger than China. And in just about 36 years, they have become 5 times bigger than India. Today, India and China can't be compared because they are so big, so bigger than us. They are so richer than us. So there is one established model of China which has eliminated poverty by focusing on certain things, which is rapid growth. If we go through the history of world, rapid growth has eliminated poverty far more rather than providing subsidies. In some sense, if we see, rapid growth is possible by investment. For investment, you need savings. But in India, while we have gone out to get foreign direct investments and foreign portfolio investments, we haven't ensured fair allocation of Indian savings. In last 10 years, we have spent more money on import of gold, silver and diamonds.
So I'm just pushing you a little.
By a foreign portfolio.
Are you saying, are you then coming to the conclusion, Nilesh Shah, that this is something we must do? It's not a case of overreaching ourselves. Is that the conclusion you're coming to?
Karan, it's too complex a problem to give a simple answer. My recommendation is that if we allocate our savings properly and improve the productivity, that will help in eliminating poverty on a longer term basis. But in the meantime, if you have to provide some sort of benefit from a social point of view, then maybe targeted benefit income or targeted basic income will be a better bet.
So in other words, this is a more sensible way of targeting for those who need it, even if it's a complicated and difficult thing to do. And you're suggesting get over the difficulties because this is a wiser way of targeting money to those who need it. Yes or no on that, Nilesh Shah?
Absolutely yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Let me put that to you in a sense, Sajid. You know, this idea is being much debated at the moment. And it's sort of become, for those who read these magazines and newspapers, a sort of flavor of the month. But do you believe the government is seriously considering even a targeted version of the universal basic income? Or is it just commentary that's whipping up a certain measure of excitement and froth, but the government is not really considering this at all?
Hard to speculate from the outside, Karan, what the government's considering, but I think this is something that's certainly worth due consideration. I know the economic survey will have some details on the cost benefits. It's not an easy, trivial issue with a glib answer. This is complicated, it's difficult, but it's now technologically possible. I mean, you asked earlier why other countries haven't done it, because the technology didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. Now we have the technology of mobile banking, electronic cash transfers, all these bank accounts being rolled out without a brick and mortar bank. So now we can leapfrog earlier systems and do it. So I think it certainly warrants consideration. It may take several years to create the physical and financial infrastructure, but I think we've lived with 60 years with very leaky, untargeted subsidies. This is clearly an improvement forward. Okay. But just one quick point, let's not forget identification with service delivery. What this does is to actually deliver the subsidy with fewer leakages to the person who is meant to get it. But this doesn't in any way let us choose who the 20% have to be. There could still be errors in identifying the 20% at the bottom of the pyramid.
Absolutely, you have to be sure you've actually chosen the right people to target. Very, very quickly, Surjit Balla, and literally in 30 seconds, so you have to control your loquacity. How do you convince Mr. Jaitley this is an idea whose time has come? But you've got 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds, basically, you did demonetization. Let not that pain be in vain. Do not try and put hurdles for yourself. Go for it, because you will never get such a chance again. India will never get such a chance again to make a radical breakthrough. It will be both politically and economically popular. So
all right, Surjit Balla, let's hope the finance minister is listening to you, and let's hope, like you, he takes his courage in his hands and says, this is a time, this is an idea whose time has come. I need now the political will to accept that reality to implement it. But somehow I have to say, I don't think politicians take such big gambles, even if we want them to. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. We'll find out the answers to all the issues we've discussed on the first. You just have to wait patiently till then to see what happens. Goodbye. Good night.